There we go. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy days to join us for what I think is going to be a really fascinating discussion about banned books and Orwell and things beyond. I'm Tim Scheel. I'm the host, I guess, facilitator today for this. I'm a professor of philosophy here at UW-Stout and director of the Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation. We won a campus award for longest name for a center. We have a big plaque we'll put over our door someday, I hope. I want to thank our co-sponsors, though, before we get very far into this. The Literature Committee and the University Library both helped to collaborate to make this happen. It's a great fit with the Literature Committee because their campus read this year is Orwell's 1984, which has sold, I had to look this up, over 30 million copies since it was published in 1949, and it ranks number 9 on the list of all-time most banned books. Not bad, top 10 finish. And of course, this is our second year working with the University Library on a Banned Books Week event, and so we really appreciate that, and we look forward to working with them on many more Banned Book Week events. If you aren't already familiar with the protocols, we ask people to keep their mics muted while the speakers are talking to minimize interference and that kind of thing. Callie Gardner, one of our student workers, has posted a survey in chat. So if you get a chance, we'd really appreciate it if you just click on a button in that survey to help let us know about how we're reaching out to our audience. We're asking you also, when you have questions pop into your head as we're going along, just put those in the chat. Kevin Yusakowski is going to help me keep track of those, and we'll get to those after the speakers have their chance to share their insights on all this. I'm going to put in a quick plug for our Free Speech Week events coming up in October. So on Monday, October 19th, Allison Kibler, who's written a great book on some of the history of hate speech, and I are going to have a conversation about pros and cons of banning hate speech. On Tuesday, October 20th, Brian Huffman, who's at UW River Falls, and John K. Wilson, who's an independent scholar, does a lot with the AAUP, are going to have a conversation about academic freedom and free speech. And on Wednesday, October 21st, we're going to have a session on cancel culture. I think I might be looking forward to that one the most. So we're going to have a New York City writer, J.C. Hallman, and a UW-Oshkosh English professor, actually, Shakespeare guy, James Duke Pesta, talking about cancel culture. So let me introduce our speakers, and then we'll let them go at it. So James, is it Tager?
Yes.
Excellent. He's going to start us out with about 20 minutes on banned books and Orwell's 1984. He is the Deputy Director of Free Expression Research and Policy at PEN America. He's a Harvard Law grad. He worked on free expression issues in Southeast Asia for, he said, 2.5 years before he came back stateside. And many of you maybe don't know, but PEN America is probably the worldwide leader in defending the expressive rights of poets, writers, editors, screenwriters, and all those folks who do this creative expression and face many challenges. Rickie-Ann Legleitner is going to follow with a conversation about some of her work on censorship and banned books in her classes. She's an English professor here at UW-Stout and the director of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. I saw she was just named one of Stout's outstanding teachers for 2020-21. So congratulations, Rickie-Ann. That's awesome. Laura McCullough is going to close it out for our speakers with 10 minutes discussing her work on women in STEM fields, and in particular her field, physics. She's, of course, a physics professor here at Stout, does all kinds of invited talks and has publications on this. She recently had a book come out on this entitled Women in Physics, which focuses on factors that affect girls' decisions to study science, their struggles in physics, gender progress in physics, and potential ways to further reduce barriers. So exciting stuff ahead. Take it away, James.
All right. Thank you. I was saying earlier, I want to thank Tim for basically giving me the greatest book report assignment of my life to date. This is the fourth time I've read, I think, 1984 as a high school student, as a college student, as a young human rights practitioner living in Myanmar, Burma, where George Orwell himself actually lived for a few years working as a colonial police person, and where he got the impetus to write what is his first book, which is called Burmese Days, which is not nearly as well known as 1984 and Animal Farm. And to read this book now as someone who is explicitly focused on work about book banning, both in the United States and abroad, was really a privilege. And there's so many potential entry points to discuss book banning when it comes to this book. There is the fact that it itself has been challenged or had bans or attempted bans on it, many times over its history since its publication around 1948. There is the fact that there is a literal the book of forbidden knowledge that is in 1984 and that plays a major role within the book. To the extent that the middle third of this of 1984 really is kind of devoted to reviewing the forbidden knowledge in this forbidden book. But I don't want to start there. I want to start with the concept of loneliness. And I think if we start there, it'll take us into a really interesting, of course, now suddenly somehow I need to turn on my screen setting. So excuse me for 2 seconds. Geez, Louise. It happened so well earlier. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. Maybe I'll just go off script, which would be pretty exciting. What stood out to me was this feeling of loneliness in the book. I mean, Winston, the main character, repeatedly comes back to the idea of loneliness, right? He talks about the locked loneliness in which one had to live, being alone and having a memory. At one point, he says to Julia, we're going to be apart eventually. Do you realize how alone that will make us? And when he writes his inscription in his diary, he writes, to a time when thought is free and when men are different from one another and do not live alone. In fact, when he's talking to O'Brien basically ends one of his points when he's torturing Winston by saying, don't you understand that you are alone? And there's a moment early in the book, about 20% in, where Winston basically waxed ecstatic about feeling this connection with O'Brien from just like a single solitary look. And that's so fascinating. He even says, I'm not even sure if O'Brien is a friend or an enemy. It's just that I have a feeling of understanding with this person, which is to say this feeling of connection, of not being alone. And I think that's really a powerful representation of some of the issues that have to do with contemporary book banning today. Now, I really do want to show you my slide, which all of a sudden, of course, Tim can attest, we did this 20 minutes ago and it seemed to work just fine. So the plot thickens. But what I want to do is compare it to something that I found really fascinating. I went and looked through several of the, there it is. Why is it not working? Several of the book bans lists that are here in the United States over the past few years. So if you look at the 1982 list from this seminal Supreme Court decision called Island Trees School District versus Pico, what happened was this was a school district in Long Island that tried to ban 11 books. And the subsequent legal battle over this ended in a Supreme Court decision that essentially carved out the extent to which to which schools can essentially assert their preferences into what books are read and what are not. Now, amongst these 11 books, you have Down These Mean Streets, which is a memoir of life in Spanish Harlem. You have The Best Short Stories of African-American Writers, edited by Langston Hughes. You have Laughing Boy, which is a book about growing up in Navajo country. A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, which is by a young African-American writer. Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, which was about the Black Panther Party. And a book about a Jewish man in Tsarist Russia. All of this is to say that books that prioritize different experiences, that were written by or were featuring sort of diverse characters or written by diverse authors, and here I'm using the term diverse as sort of a catch-all to refer to, authors of color, LGBTQ authors, even women authors, even differently abled authors. They were a large part of that book banning list. And unfortunately, that trend continues today. So that books that are written by diverse authors or featuring diverse characters are disproportionately likely to be challenged or banned. If you look at the 2019 list, so the ALA, the American Library Association, puts out its top 10 list every year. This past year, 8 of the top 10 most banned books featured or were written by LGBTQ people, right? 8 out of 10. That's illustrative of the dynamic I'm talking about. You go the next year, you go to 2018, you'll see a lot of LGBTQ books. You'll also see Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, and you'll see other books by African-American writers, right? The point being that it really is a truism when it comes to book banning in the United States today, that books that sort of highlight different experiences from ethnic minorities or LGBTQ people or other sort of areas of diversity are more likely to be banned. Now, where am I going with this? We have Winston and his feeling of loneliness, which is sort of this political feeling of loneliness, and we have diversity of different opinions being more likely to be banned. Well, it reminds me of a quote from Junot Diaz, the writer who writes, well, do you know how vampires have no reflections in a mirror? He says, there's this idea that monsters don't have reflection in a mirror. And what I've always thought isn't that monsters don't have reflections. It's that if you want to make a human being into a monster, deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. He goes on to say, growing up, I felt like a monster in some ways. And he's talking about his experiences growing up as a Hispanic man. And he says, I didn't see myself reflected at all. I was like, yo, is something wrong with me? That the whole society seems to think that people like me don't exist, right? The whole society seems to think that people like me don't exist. That is a thread of the psychology that Winston has throughout this book, right? This is, in some ways, a battle for Winston's sanity, which he sort of eventually loses over trying to decide whether or not he's the only one that feels the way he feels. He's the only one who thinks the way he thinks and has the experiences that he is experiencing. He sees himself not reflected anywhere else in society, right? He feels alone in knowing that 2 + 2 makes 4, because that's what he knows. And the rest of society is sort of dedicated, it seems, to denying him that knowledge. When he finally meets with Julia and O'Brien in O'Brien's home, there's a triumphant line. The chapter starts with, they had done it at last. That triumphant they, the feeling of being not alone, the feeling of being part of a community, is what acts us to ideas that, that may not be part of the mainstream discourse, or may be something that you as part of your identity need to be exposed to convince yourself that you're not alone, that you're not, a crazy person wandering through the society alone. And when we look at contemporary book banning today, that is one of the issues with contemporary book banning. And there's not just book challenges that come from the ground up that have this problem, but recent bills. In Florida last year was proposed what's called Senate Bill 1454, which would create a prohibited content list ostensibly for the purpose of blocking obscenity in Florida schools. And it incorporated over 100 books like The Kite Runner, which centers the experience of Muslim Americans, The Bluest Eye, which centers the experience of African Americans, and Mama, Mommy, and Me, which centers the experience of LGBTQ Americans. In Missouri, this year, it was also proposed in Tennessee, a bill that was called in Missouri House Bill 2088, which would have created a parental review board to ban books. right? Librarians who refused to comply with such a book ban, by the way, and the rule was basically these parental review boards would be 5 people from the local community. They didn't even have to be parents, could basically decide what books were unfit to be read by minors. If you were a library that continued to offer these books to minors, your funding would be cut. And if you were a librarian who gave these books to minors despite the ban, you could go to jail for up to a year. Now, the proponent of that bill explicitly said he did this because he disagreed with the decision of public libraries to have drag queen story nights, right? So it was very explicitly aimed at limiting LGBTQ content in the public sphere. And one of the things that I was saying at the time, along with many others, is if you are, a young gay kid watching books essentially disappear from the bookshelves that talk about your experience, how alienating and isolating that would be, and how you would feel alone. And that is one of the things that really stood out to me in this reading. The sensation of Winston's feeling of loneliness and how he was basically looking for any connection to essentially convince him that he was not alone in feeling the way he felt. I mean, to the point where he even says, after reading the book, he's like, I actually already knew these things. But he seems to gain solace from the fact that someone else is repeating to him the experience that resonates with him. There's also, of course, just the obsession in this book between banned books and history. Very explicitly, the party, which is here synonymous with the government, is trying to rewrite history. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. That famous axiom that is one of the most famous lines of 1984. Winston says, by far the more important reason for the readjustment of the past, this is not Winston, this is actually the banned book itself. The most important reason is the need to safeguard the infallibility of the party. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. And O'Brien later says during that pivotal torture scene, we, the party, control all the records and we control all the memories. Then we control the past, and whatever the party holds to be the truth is truth. There is a substantial portion of the book dedicated to this idea of basically the government's ability or lack thereof to essentially rewrite history. When I was reading the book, rereading the book just the other day, you know what it made me think of? It made me think of some of the remarks made by the president earlier this month at the first White House Conference on American History. And some of you may recall this, where he was talking about essentially his decision to start a 1776 commission, which would promote, quote unquote, patriotic education. He said, critical race theory, this is a quote, critical race theory, the 1619 Project, which is the New York Times examination of the ways that slavery has affected the country, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda and ideological poison. Right? So what we have is the president identifying trends or specific projects that he felt were sort of too critical, and painted the nation and the government in too critical a light, and explicitly created this new commission to, in his vision, to rectify that. When we compare that with Orwell and the idea that the vision within 1984 of the party is to create an internal present where the party is and has always been right, it certainly sits very uncomfortably with me, and I hope it sits very uncomfortably with you. History is such a fascinating aspect of it. It reminds me of a major book banning law that was on the books for quite a while, and that's Arizona Statute 15111 and 15112. This is a bill that became law in 2010 in the state of Arizona, and it made it illegal to teach ethnic or cultural studies in Arizona schools. The language was, you could not have a course or class that promoted the overthrow of the United States government, promoted resentment towards a race or class of people, was designed primarily for pupils of a particular ethnic group, or that advocated ethnic solidarity instead of the treatment of pupils as individuals. And as a result of this law, It was illegal to teach ethnic or cultural studies in Arizona schools for about 7 years. It was eventually struck down by a federal judge who wrote that the law was motivated by racial animus. And as a lawyer, I can tell you, motivated by racial animus is legalese for saying that something is racist. But it took a long time, right? It took several years for this to wend its way through the court until the law was eventually invalidated. So, any students listening to this, I mean, whether you're a professor or student, people your age in Arizona were affected by this law. If you have any Arizona students, I mean, this was something that tangibly and specifically affected the lives of kids throughout the country. And it is, of course, a representation of a book banning effort, because when you block these courses, you're blocking all the books that kids would be exposed to alongside them, and through the view of essentially trying to give a vision of history that was more complementary than what legislators felt the vision of history was being offered in ethnic study courses. I lecture a lot specific on book bans, but also specifically on book bans in American prison. I often ask the question of students, what is the largest book ban in the United States? And they'll usually list individual states, and that's obviously a very good instinct. But I answer the question by saying it has to do with our prisons. With over 2.2 million Americans incarcerated, the system of literature restrictions that affects the incarcerated population collectively is the largest book ban in the country, affecting millions of people. And I go through examples. There's a great test I love. If you Google it, you can find it. It's "So Do You Have What It Takes to Be a Prison Center" by the Marshall Project. And it's just a list of books, and you have to vote and decide whether you think those books were banned or not in Arizona prisons. And let me tell you, some of the results are a little crazy. So drawing from that, some of the books that have banned Auschwitz, there's a book on Auschwitz that was banned for explicit violence. There were episodes of The Nation or the Weekly Standard, which are magazines, and one was blocked because it went too deeply into the war in Afghanistan. The title of the article was "America's Afghan Victims." That was blocked for explicit violence. An article on the Ferguson protests was blocked for explicit violence. And then there's a book, New Jim Crow. That's a book to keep in mind if you're looking at contemporary prison book bans today. It's a book by Princeton University professor Michelle Alexander, and it's been blocked in prisons across the country. Now, thankfully, usually when it comes to people's attention, there's a public outcry and the prison reverses itself. But as I constantly say with prison book bans, the issue is that prisons are normally such opaque places that the average person really has very little idea what's allowed and what's banned in those prisons. Now, the New Jim Crow is an examination of how mass incarceration, in the argument of Professor Alexander, is a continuation of racist policies such as Jim Crow and even slavery. And when it's been blocked in prisons across the country, I remember a quote from one formerly incarcerated person who was asked, well, why do you think they blocked it? And the person said, oh, it's obvious to me that why they blocked it because they don't want us to have that type of knowledge, right? Books that question, books that critically portray episodes of American history or aspects of American policy that are critical are more likely to be banned in American prisons. Unfortunately, there are a lot of racial components to that. So books that, discuss, the famous example is how in Texas, which has a banned books list that's believed to be up to 15,000 books right now, the oral histories of civil rights leaders are blocked, but books by David Duke and Adolf Hitler allowed. Right? That's illustrative of some of the biases that are present within sort of the book banning apparatus within our prison and how they play out. And a lot of that has to do with critical examinations of history. I'm already nearing the end of my 20 minutes. I could just talk for 1,000 minutes about this. But I think the final thing I want to end you with is this line that I loved from the book. And this is, if we recall, Winston, the protagonist, is himself a censor. His job is to censor. And he writes, even the written instructions which Winston received in which he invariably got rid of as soon as he dealt with them. They never instated or implied that an act of forgery was to be committed. Always the reference was to slips, errors, misprints, or misquotations, which it was necessary to put right in the interests of accuracy. I loved this line because to me it was illustrative of one of the biggest issues with book banning anywhere, and certainly book banning today, which is that quite often, not always, depending on the government you're dealing with, but quite often, censors will not say they are censoring. Censors will often say they are committed to freedom of information and expression in the abstract. It's only these specific books that somehow should be shunted away for special reasons. Right? You'll hear of this through the lens of obscenity. You'll hear of this through the lens of protecting our children. You'll hear of this through the lens of national security. But I've certainly in the American context, in my years of work doing this, I certainly can't remember an example where someone proposed a book banning idea and said, oh, by the way, and I fully acknowledge this is censorship. It doesn't happen. You know, with the Chinese government, I do a lot on autocratic regimes, including China. They'll admit it more freely because they've sort of, streamlined and mainlined the idea of censorship. But certainly in the United States, as well as many other countries around the world, censors do not acknowledge that they are censoring. And I always point that out to be like, hey, don't be fooled. The final thing I want to end you with is the point that I try to end all of my conversations about book banning with. Book banning is not a thing of the past. Some of the examples, and the examples I've given you are almost all within the past 10 years. Some of these legal proposals that have occurred this year or last year. And it's illustrative of the fact that 1984, I mean, it's almost technically, it's time bound in the sense that it has a specific date to it, 1984. But unfortunately, Orwell really is classic. And the need for vigilance against book banning really is, unfortunately, a timeless need. And that's certainly something I think he would agree with me with if he were alive and attending this talk. In fact, I'm sure he'd say, great job, James. I feel like you crushed it. You totally understood everything I was trying to say. But maybe that's just my personal bias. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to give remarks, and I look forward to hearing from the other presenters. Thank you.
Well, a little clap for James there. Thanks. Rickie-Ann, you ready?
I am ready. All right. Thank you, James. I have to say, I think our points will complement each other nicely. I am definitely not an expert on censorship or the First Amendment, but my work, my PhD is in American literature, focusing on women writers specifically, and on identity studies. So things like disability studies, gender studies, critical race theory. So the texts that I work with are multicultural, diverse texts. And when these are the texts that you work with, you can't help but encounter instances of banning and censorship, especially in K-12 curriculum in the last 40 years. The 1980s really marked kind of a push for multiculturalism to enter our school system. And as soon as that push happened, there was immediate pushback. And that has really, really maintained over the last 40 years. And I think, as James noted, in the last 10 years, we see a specific pushback against the LGBTQIA+ community. And I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat to the ALA list that James referenced here, so you can kind of get that visual of what books have been banned. And it's not just the LGBTQIA+ community, but it's books that look at gender identity specifically. So looking at transgender identity that have become really controversial. So these bannings and challenges typically reflect our cultural moment. And that is, I think, with the controversy, especially in the school systems, with access to bathrooms, with being able to use the pronouns that you feel comfortable with being able to use the name that you feel comfortable with. We see kind of those controversies pop up in the literature that's then being challenged. And also, as James said, this issue is as old as the United States is. And I know in my teaching, my students are kind of surprised that books would be challenged or banned in the United States. They seem to think that's something that happens elsewhere. Like, oh, that sounds so World War II, Germany or something, right? That it's a fascist problem. But it's like, no, we have the same issue here. And I think a lot of times it's invisible, especially in the K through 12 system, because these are curriculum decisions. So a student may not realize that they don't have access to certain literature, or that these choices are being made for them, because it's all kind of happening behind the scenes, right? So it might be, as James noted, pushback from parental groups. It could be religious organizations. It could be political policies that go into place. There's a lot of things that come forward with this. But with curriculum, there's a lot of leeway in terms of what you teach and what you don't teach. And I think for me in my literature courses that I teach, I guess I should say I do teach a course specifically on banned and challenged books as part of the honors curriculum. I also teach a composition course that I focus on free speech and censorship. And I do think these are important topics for students to engage with, so they know that this is something that happens. And so they can start to consider these ideas. So going along with that, sorry, losing my place as I go off script here. So as you're kind of looking at high school curriculums, maybe more specifically is usually what I focus on, is what texts are actually being taught. And I think this gets to bigger questions of, okay, first, what is literature? What is literary canon? Whose voices are we hearing and whose voices are absent? So going to James's point about loneliness and seeing yourself reflected in the literature you're reading, we've really come to understand, especially in the last 40 years, that it's so important for the development of a student's esteem, sense of identity, to see themselves in literature. But it's also really important for students to experience the lives and perspectives of those who are different than them, so they can develop skills such as empathy and understanding. And I think most of us could agree in our current political moment, we could use some more empathy and understanding. And literature becomes a really key way that we develop those skills, especially in K through 12. So when we start restricting what literature we teach, that gets really, really problematic. So just to give you some examples of some of the books that I do teach specifically in the banned books course, and there were so many to pick from. Like this was a hard list to narrow down, I will say. So I usually start with Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 because it's a banned book about banned books, which makes me really, really happy on a lot of levels. So it's a good kind of entry point into that. And I always have students in that section who have read Fahrenheit 451 in high school and did not realize they read the censored version of this novel. There's a censored version that is taught in our school systems that gets rid of explicit language, gets rid of references to religion. So there are different versions of this particular text that circulate, and students have no idea that they're getting the clean version of the text. So that's always a good discussion. I teach Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. That is like the notorious banned book in American literature, and depending on our political moment, it's been banned for so many different reasons. For language, for the use of the N-word, for depictions of sympathetic depictions of slaves, again, depending on that historical context. More recently, it's typically banned for the use of the N-word. I've also seen versions of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn where the final chapter is cut, because the final chapter kind of shows how horribly the slave figure is treated in the whole book and kind of undermines all of the, I don't know, like humanizing impact that supposedly the book has. Whole other discussion, sorry, tangent. I teach Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, which I believe James mentioned. That is a really, really important book that gets banned usually for sexually explicit content. It does feature incest and rape, which are really heavy topics. And there is pushback that there have been parents who say this book is inappropriate for any age group. Nobody should be reading this. But these are things that happen in real life. These are things that students experience. And these are important issues that we need to talk about. Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which is a graphic novel that tells the story of coming of age of a woman who realizes that she's a lesbian and that her father may be gay or bisexual. She's not sure, depending on his history. So it's a lot of exploring of sexual identity. But because it's a graphic novel, there has been pushback saying that it's pornographic. I would say it is not. But this is a book that's actually been successfully banned at the college level, which I think makes it really, really interesting. And these were at religiously affiliated colleges, I should note. So that gets a little more complicated. And then, again, another great shout out to James here. Sandra Cisneros' House on Mango Street was one of the books that fell victim to Arizona's 1.5, 1.11, and 1.12 kind of policies there for its Mexican-American content. And the book itself was accused of teaching people how to overthrow the government, which if you've read House on Mango Street, it's a coming of age story. It's a series of little vignettes of a young girl growing up in Chicago. I'm not sure how it teaches you how to overthrow the government. The chapter that specifically gets targeted is where the young girl dreams about having a house and letting homeless people sleep in her attic so they have a place to stay. And apparently that's the controversial content. And then Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, which is just terrifying in terms of how that's coming true right now. That's a whole other discussion as well. But that book gets banned for sexually explicit content. And then Marjane Satrapi's The Complete Persepolis, which is another graphic novel, and that gets into controversy in terms of depiction of religion and different kind of cultural depictions there. So again, these are just a handful of books, and that was kind of just a little sampling of reasons that things get banned. But part of the reason I think it's important to teach these texts is it encourages students to have really difficult conversations about difficult topics that impact themselves, that impact their peers, that impact people that they'll encounter in the workplace. These are important issues to talk about. We can't avoid talking about race or gender or sexual assault or things that do impact us very, very directly. And I think these discussions also kind of connect to larger questions like, should hate speech be banned? Should prayer be banned in school? Should flag burning be banned? Should criticism of the government be limited? Should the ability to protest be limited? Should the press be restricted? All of these questions are really big questions that students should be able to grapple with as citizens. So I think these are all really, really important issues. So I will wrap it up there. And again, thank you to James for all those lovely connections. That was awesome. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Laura has to say as well.
Great. Thanks, Rickie-Ann. Laura.
All right. Hello, everybody. Well, in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try to broaden your definition of censorship. We typically think of censorship as something that's very active, the banned books, the words that you can't say on TV, the oh bleep types of things. There are a lot of other forms of censorship and ways to block participation, ways that are more subtle. Censorship is often about what people believe is proper or true or appropriate. James had mentioned that, banned books often highlight different experiences. And we often see banned books focusing on different truths. In 1984, Orwell talked about objective truth. I mean, it was a big thing for him. And what does objective truth really mean? Well, when I hear objective truth, as a scientist, I identify with that. scientists often identify with that, because what we are trying to find is what is true about the world. We want to understand the world. We want to figure out what is true. So science and objective truth are often closely related. Now, in the early half of the 1900s in fascist Spain, the dictator Francisco Franco actually dismantled the Academy of Sciences in Spain, so the National Organization of Science. He dismantled it. It was gone, and he instituted in its place his own scientific committee. And that committee controlled what was done in science, what science was published, what science was allowed in from other countries, because he wanted to control what was true. He wanted to control that knowledge. Galileo was under house arrest for years and years because his vision of what was true, his knowledge of what was true, didn't mesh with what the Pope said. And so this idea of knowledge and truth is very important to the idea of censorship. And this isn't just in the past. 2 years ago, I was sitting down with one of my fellow UW-Stout professors, and he was showing me pictures on his phone of his fellow academics in Turkey being arrested, taken out of their homes, being taken out of their offices at their university. Why? Because they were professors. So when someone wants to control what is known, what is considered true, you need to control the ones who are sharing the knowledge, and you need to control the ones who are creating the knowledge. Now, control of knowledge is an absolutely frightening tool, and 1984 does a good job of exploring how frightening that can be. But those are the broader, the bigger, more obvious ways of controlling. There are a lot of other ways of controlling knowledge and creation and who can do what. Another example is in Nazi Germany. In 1933, the Nazis changed the German girls' school curriculum. They removed Latin and science and replaced them with more German and home ec, because the Nazi woman was at home and she stayed at home and raised children. So why did she need science? Why did she need Latin? How many girls missed out on science? How many wonderful, passionate people about science did we lose that decision? So again, control is a very frightening thing. Historically, we've had women who couldn't attend university, who couldn't be professors or be researchers. What they did, if they did have that passion for science, is they said, okay, how can I get around this rule? Well, I got a brother who does science. I'll work with him. I got, let's see, there's a guy over there who wants to marry me. He does science. I'll marry him. And so a lot of women in science over the years have managed to do their science because of their husband or their brother or some other person. Were they ever credited with it? No. James had mentioned the quote about controlling history. Controlling the past, you control the future. And if in history we have been censoring out these women who have been part of major, major scientific investigations, well, you look back and you say, oh, there aren't women there, so women apparently don't do science. So controlling history again, controlling what people understand from the past is very important. Now that's all historical. What do we do now? What are we doing in the 21st century to control women's contributions to science? Are we doing anything? Well, yeah, I would say so. It's not as overt anymore. My mother-in-law was told she couldn't take physics because she was a woman. And that sort of thing isn't as obvious anymore. We don't see that level, that overt, obvious stuff anymore. However, what we're dealing with now, the censorship, the silencing of women, is much more subtle and scary. I felt it first when I attended grad school. My first day of grad school, for physics grad school, I walked in and there was a room and it was 24 guys and me. You gotta believe that I said, I'm not sure I fit here. So we have all these ways of controlling what people do, what people believe. I want to give you an example that's active right now, like in today's world. I want you to stop and picture a scientist at work, okay? What do you picture when you think of a scientist at work? I'm guessing that most of you picture somebody in a lab coat, and it's a white guy, probably with weird hair. Somebody in a lab coat with equipment at a lab bench or something. Well, there are a lot of scientists who are lab bench scientists. What happens when you get the order to shelter in place? What happens when a pandemic comes and says you have to stay home? You can't be near any other person. COVID has caused major effects on science in this country and every other country it's hit. We are losing science because of this. And that effect is not even across all scientists. There is a study of how COVID has affected scientists. And it's a study of a group from Harvard and Northwestern and some national labs. It's a big group. And what they found is that the people who are affected most by COVID are, no surprise, women. And the group that's affected the most, women with children. So there's a whole bunch of women with children out there who are being hugely affected by the pandemic. And that means they're not doing their work. There's data from the University of Southern California at Dornsife that says 33% of employed mothers have primary childcare responsibilities, whereas only 7% of employed fathers. 33, a third of employed mothers have primary childcare, 7% of men. So yeah, who's gonna take the time off, do you think? Who's gonna say, no, I can go to the lab later? And it's even worse for women of color. Black kids are more than twice as likely to grow up in a single parent home as white kids. And so if you're in a single parent home, just imagine what it's like to be dealing with this right now. And if you are a female scientist, single parent mother, you have no choices. You have no choices. So we're seeing this right now. And what are the effects of them? There's research on the early published research articles on COVID. I don't know why people looked at this, but they did. So there's more than one study right now looking at all the research articles on COVID that were published. And while typically in these fields, women should be 40% of authors on articles, women are only a quarter, 25% of authors. That is silencing. That is censorship. This is a very subtle form of censorship because of the way that our society has built up our biases, our expectations. It's the woman who takes care in the home. Now, why should we care? Why does it matter that women are not there as much? That was a cat sneezing, excuse me. Well, there's also research that says in the medical fields that if you have women on your team, you're far more likely to actually disaggregate your data by gender and sex. We know from other countries that COVID has sex-related differences. If people are not studying those, that's a big problem. And gender differences, sex differences, excuse me, in the medical fields is really important. You know, the biggest heart disease research, it was 22,000 men, Harvard aspirin study back in 1989. 22,000 men, they studied for a while, and Harvard said, okay, aspirin helps prevent heart attacks. Great. So for the next 20 some years, everybody said, take aspirin to avoid heart attacks. Did you catch that? 22,000 men? Finally, somebody said, well, maybe we should test this on women too. And it didn't happen until 2005 when somebody studied with 40,000 women, and they found out that aspirin does nothing for women for heart attacks. Doesn't do a thing. And so missing out on the gender differences in research is really important. Women are more likely to have problems with drugs. They're more likely to have over or underdosing and side effects because most of the clinical trials only have men. And so we need to be very careful to include women, not only in our subjects, but in the research groups. And if we are keeping female scientists from doing their job, we're missing out on a huge thing. Another example is, where the conversations happen. I attended a talk by Melissa Franklin, who's a physicist at Harvard. And she was one of the first female physicists at Harvard. She was mentioning having this great conversation with two of her colleagues, and they're talking, walking down the hall. Her two male colleagues go into the men's room. She follows them because she says, well, we were having a conversation. I assumed we needed to keep talking. Where the conversations also happen, that's also a bit of censorship. You hear about the old boys club and the things that happen at the golf course, that sort of thing. This is another form of censorship and silencing. Censorship isn't just about voices. It isn't just about books. It's about knowledge. It's what we already know, how we share that, and who's allowed to keep expanding what we know, who's working on what we know. Censorship is also part of that loneliness effect. James was talking about the loneliness in 1984. And again, when I was the only woman in that class of 24, not only did I get the message that physics isn't for women, but that loneliness of I am the only one was very strong for me. And so censorship is this huge, broad thing. You can't think of it as just banned books or, the hey bleep on TV. Censorship happens everywhere, and it's terribly bad for society. How much more quickly could we get a vaccine for COVID if we had all hands on deck? If all the women who were epidemiologists and infectious disease people could actually be at work? How much earlier might we have had all these wonderful inventions like the touch screen or the wheelchair that helps people go from sitting to standing? There are all these amazing ideas we might have missed because of the censorship and the silencing of women in science. The circular saw was invented by a woman. The dishwasher, the fire escape, those were all invented by women. We need women's voices, and we need women's knowledge, not just in science, but everywhere. We need to be hearing women's experience in every part of our lives. Censorship comes in many forms, but in every form it is bad. And in every form it is bad for society. It's bad for everyone. And that's what I've got to say. So thank you.
Thanks, Laura. So we'll entertain some questions now, and it looks like we've got one up there for our panelists. So Corey's interested in your thoughts about disinformation and the role that plays in this story we're telling today.
I'll jump on that, being a scientist, feeling very strongly about science disinformation. We have seen in the last 4 years an amazing amount of disinformation being sent out there, particularly with science. I mean, just look at the COVID data that's been out there. You see something that the CDC puts up, they take it down. You see something that someone else puts up, they take it down. It's no wonder that the majority of people, that the public are confused, all these different ideas and messages, and the disinformation that's being sent out there is particularly dangerous and in some cases lethal, because we're getting people who don't believe that masks help. Well, every bit of evidence we have from every single country says masks are the best way to deal with COVID. And yet, when you get that disinformation that masks aren't really doing anything, it's, this is killing people. The disinformation right now is killing people. Okay, I'll stop.
Can I jump in? I mean, just a couple quick points. My organization, Pen America, we've put out a couple reports on disinformation now, which are available for free on our website, www.pen.org. Okay, I'm done with my shameless plug. one of the things I'm most proud about is in the first report, we talk about why we, a free expression organization, we're doing a report on disinformation. And one of the things we talk about is disinformation as a free expression issue because it pollutes the civic discourse, right? How can you have a discussion where people actually are able to weigh competing ideas and participate in the civic conversation if they're unsure of what's true and what's not? And then regarding what we're seeing now, which is the increasing weaponization of disinformation, not just from foreign actors, but also from domestic actors who are cynically using it for political purposes, this line from Orwell really stood out to me when he was talking about how to double think. And it goes, quote, "To tell deliberate lies while genuinely believing them, to forget any fact that has become inconvenient, and then when it becomes necessary again, to draw it back from oblivion for just so long as it is needed, to deny the existence of objective reality, and all the while to take account of the reality which one denies. All of this is indispensably necessary." So I think Orwell actually, that to me gets at disinformation, and more specifically, it gets at certainly, political actors, people in positions of public trust, who when they evince a sort of flagrant disregard for the truth, that's something that Orwell pinpointed very specifically as injurious to democracy and freedom.
Yeah, I think just one quick little thing to add, because Laura and James, you covered that very nicely, is just whoever controls the narrative controls perception 100%. And that's why I think it's so important, especially in our moment we find ourselves, to teach critical thinking skills, to teach people how to identify bullshit when they come across it, to be a little crass there, but that's what it is. It's really, really vital. And I think especially as educators, that really falls on us at this point to really help people navigate that.
Well, if I can jump in, we're almost out of time, but I have sort of a follow-up, I guess I'd like to throw at you. So the critical thinking skills and the willingness to challenge what is sort of the accepted truth, to believe in objective truth. Is this sort of a failure of our schools to sort of inculcate these qualities in students so that they lack these sorts of skills and become susceptible to disinformation and other issues?
I think that's the difference between like having to memorize and regurgitate information versus having to critically analyze, assess, and engage with knowledge in a different way. And I think oftentimes because our K through 12 system has fallen into the standardized test trap where students have to pass these tests for schools to get funding, and so we teach to tests now in K through 12. So students have to learn this set of skills, this set of information, or schools don't get their funding. So K through 12 isn't set up to teach critical thinking skills unless you are privileged, if you're in AP classes, if you're not going to public school but private school, you can kind of get out of that. But I think a lot of times I get a lot of students in my classes at the college level who are really engaging with critical thinking skills for the very first time. And that's incredibly problematic.
I'll just say ditto.
Yeah, I'll leave that to the educators to answer, so I'm happy to move.
Okay. We're at 5:30, so we're heading into overtime here. If people are interested, I will ask the indulgence of our speakers to hang around for maybe a couple more minutes. I see there's a couple more questions popping up in the chat here. We'll just keep going, but if anybody needs to check out, feel free to jump out of the conversation as you need to. So Lopa asked the question, how do we remain vigilant about censorship? How do you find out what's being censored and who's censoring it, and how do you resist it?
Yell a lot. I mean, it's a really good question, and so much of American book banning plays out from the ground up, right? Thankfully, unlike many other countries, the US, there's no federal government list of banned books that they disseminate out to every school district, right? For example. Instead, the way that book challenges or book bans, which is just a book challenge that was successful, play out is often where one person, a few parents or one administrator or one one librarian or whatever decides one book is problematic, pushes someone to pull it off from the shelves, and it disappears, right? The average book ban in the United States is presumably invisible because it's one person or two people making a decision to take a book off a shelf and not telling anyone, right? So any visibility that you're able to bring is really what's needed. Public visibility, sunlight being the best disinfectant, is really what's called for here. Unfortunately, PEN America, we did a report on about the issues faced by local news. A lot of the times, who's breaking this story are local journalists, right? So if you want to be vigilant against book bans in your community, make sure you're reading local news. Is one of the first things that come to mind. But then, of course, know the advocacy organizations that do this work. I'd humbly submit our own advocacy organization's name into that list. But the American Library Association tracks these issues, and everyone should basically have them on their proverbial speed dial for challenges like this. And of course, conversations just like this one, which positively inculcate the idea of why we need to resist book banning and being vigilant against the fact that most book bans will not come in the guise of a nice, pretty stamped parcel that says this is a book ban. So those levels of engagement are for me the first kind of steps to take.
To build off that, I think especially since we're seeing a lot of local news sources disappear across the country due to funding issues, is to pay attention to your local school board meetings. So here in Menominee, we had the book I Am Malayla challenged several times by parents. It's being taught in the 7th grade language arts program. And I attended those school board meetings. I don't have kids, but I'm very invested in that book not being censored or banned because it's a very important book. And parents were pushing back because of the teaching of Islam faith in the middle school, and there was a lot of Islamophobia, to be straightforward, that was coming through with that. Luckily, it has not successfully been banned despite these challenges, but I think that's because people showed up to the school board meeting and defended that curriculum. So I think paying attention to those events is crucial to really, really supporting this.
And to take it one step even broader, well, broader and closer than the two of you were talking about, look for primary sources and use different sources of media. If you always get all of your news from one or two sources, you are not getting the real news. You need to broaden who you get news from, who you read, and you need to say, okay, well, this is their take on what happened. Is there an on-the-ground recording or discussion of what actually happened? So I would also add that.
I think I saw one more question there that we can cover. So the question of the power of large corporations to control the flow of information. I mean, I can recall some very large gifts to universities to science or other STEM programs. And they were all conditioned on the giver having some control over the information that was produced. So if the study produced something the giver didn't want made public, they could just bury the findings of that research. It's just one example. There's many more.
In one of my assignments for my class, students look at an article, a science article, and I have them do various types of scientific thinking. But they actually, one week I have them specifically look up who funded this research. Specifically because that is something we should always be aware of. And so, you know, when you're looking at just even basic research, you should be aware of who funded it. The reason that cholesterol was, you know, the big baddie for so many years is because, well, the sugar industry had better people. And so sugar industry had money and said, nope, 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 problem isn't sugar, nope. And so who funds research is a big part of it. And that's something that should be made more obvious, I think, in science.
I again will leave, you know, the content of these answers to this one to the educators, but I will just note that my colleagues at Penn America, there's a campus free speech program at Penn America, and some of my colleagues deal with these and related issues. And if you're curious, you can read more about that program on our website. And I know that if my colleague was magically here, he'd have a much more involved answer. But otherwise, I'm going to defer to the educators on this one.
And I'll just echo Laura, even though I mean, I teach literature, women, gender studies classes, I still have my students evaluate sources, and I always go, okay, so who's sponsoring this? Who's paying for this? Like, look, follow the money is what it comes down to if you really want to know if there's some intention there. And I think there's a big difference between sources that acknowledge where their money comes from and say, okay, hey, they have no influence here despite the fact they're funding this. This is our agreement. If there's transparency there, versus if they're not acknowledging it, that makes a really, really big difference in how you then perceive that information.
And to add to Rickie-Ann's comment, my husband is an author. He has 14 books in print. When he published his first book, there were something like 12 major publishers. We're down to 5 or 4. And so the sources are getting closed and closed and closed. You know, we're seeing fewer and fewer sources of information. I mean, and that's fiction, but they're deciding what fiction gets published. And so just like with the news sources going away, our local news sources going away, it's not just in the nonfiction realm. It's across everything that we need to be careful about who controls the knowledge.
Well, let's call it a day. I want to thank our 3 speakers. They've done a terrific job and offered us a lot of interesting things to think about and consider and debate. And of course, we always want to encourage everyone to look further into this. Don't rest easy with just what we've heard today. Always exercise your own critical thinking skills and ability to pursue truth and go for it. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks for coming in, and we'll look forward to hosting more sessions in the future. Thanks and good night.
Thanks, Tim and Lopa.
Thanks
for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, the record button's off now, so now we can say what we really think.
Oh,
it's funny.
I'll just hang around a few minutes and make sure everybody can check out okay.
yeah, it was very good, very smooth, and it went very well. No glitches, except I think James couldn't get his PowerPoint on or something, but it didn't make any difference. It it was perfectly understandable.
Perfect.
Thank you, James.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was a privilege.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.
Send some of that San Diego weather our way.
Yeah, I'm sure you could borrow it. I believe it.
We'll trade. So I'm a big fan of Penn America.
Thank you so much.
And very interested in campus free speech issues. So I will definitely have to check further into your website and what you got going on there, and try to chat with a few people.
Perfect. I'd love that. Yeah, I have a couple colleagues who that's what they do, and they're brilliant at it. So it would be a great connection. Yeah, I think that would be awesome. If you want me to facilitate an intro, I'd be more than happy to.
That'd be terrific.
Okay.
But, one of the problems really for people working in free speech and academic freedom these days is there's just so many people doing work in that area now that it's just it's very difficult to keep up with everything that's going on and who's doing it all. So
Concur.
This is a great connection to have made for me today.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I'll make that happen.
Okay. Well, I think I'm going to check out too. I got an hour and a half drive home. So
bless your heart.
Okay, James, this is Ellen again. I want to ask you just those couple short questions.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah,
Good night.
Tim, great program. I really enjoyed this. I did some comments, but I didn't put it on the microphone. I chatted. I really liked this event. Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
James.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
And-
we
I don't
aim
know-
to please, and these three did a terrific job.
Oh, great. Okay.
Okay, good night.
I'm going to look at the form, James, and I'm going to ask you the question, okay?
Hit me.
Okay. Okay, can you see the form there,
Oh, please.
James? I put
Yes.
it up.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, and I think, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I think if you would, for your slide presentation, and I just learned this today from my great student workers who's helping me with all this modern technology, because
Yeah.
I'm older air, that you hit that share button up there. I think it would have came on because you would have shared your screen. But
Okay.
anyways, the question there, it says entertainer, a public speaker section. Are they yes or no's?
Oh, I am a public speaker, I suppose, and I am not a Wisconsin resident. So yes, and then no.
So it's a yes and then a no. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can even put, I'll do that later.
Thank you so
So
much.
your number one is yes and number two is no. And then let's see, trying to get it. Over there where it says residency,
Yes.
we need that filled out too. So I assume, I don't know, you are U.S. citizen, resident, I
correct.
assume.
That's correct.
So you can't assume anything nowadays.
No,
right?
it's true. It's true. That's wisdom.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I say I have aged. I don't say I'm older anymore. I just say I've gained more knowledge in my life.
I love that. I love that.
So are you a legal resident of California then?
Yeah, this year normally I'm based in New York, but I've spent the past 8 months in California, so I'll be a legal resident of California for this year for tax purposes.
Okay, and I don't know what that all means, but
Yeah.
all I know is if I send some things in and I don't have everything what the accounting wants, then they'll send it back to me, and then I'll have to bug you again.
Right.
So these are just a few little minors. Those other forms that was filled out has been okay in the system. So either I don't know if I'll do it tonight yet or tomorrow. I'll take care of getting
Thank
this
you
all
so much.
circulated. And again, thank you so much. You are.
Oh,
It has been very interesting,
so much.
and I can't, banning the book is also like the First Amendment, freedom of speech.
Yep.
But
absolutely.
you can see though, I mean, people don't know what freedom. I don't think everybody's opinion of what freedom of speech is being, tested. And I think if we just live by the golden rule, just let everybody I know there's some people that we don't like what they're saying,
Mhm.
but then just don't go listen to them. just don't go see them. That's our right. But of course,
Yep.
I think there's people that likes to be controversial.
Yeah.
I like different opinions, but of course our center is based on being civil about it. So so thank you so much.
Thank
And
you for having me. It's a
This,
privilege.
this Penn America I think is a very interesting. How long have you been there?
4 years plus now. Yeah. It's been after I moved back from Southeast Asia, I started almost immediately with them.
Okay. Well, you're very, very access to them. And again, I can't say enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That
I
really
found
means
this
a lot.
so enjoyable, and so I just wish that we could have had on campus some more people
I
would
know.
come. Because, we're talking about, there's a lot of older people, a lot of people in rural areas. I started working home remotely, and I'm in a kind of my internet's not very good. I'm just starting to get very better at that. And if I wouldn't not have to, I love working because it does give me opportunity to learn more things. But if I didn't have this internet, I wouldn't know anything about this. So
Well,
thank you.
glad we could make this happen. It's a privilege to speak about what I believe to be a very important subject. So I really appreciate y'all for making it possible.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to leave. So
Okay.
I don't have to say, be careful driving to the airport. Be careful going up those beautiful stairs, though.
Thank you. I will. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye,
All right,
James.
be well.